Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Dr. Ramzy Baroud, journalist, author, and the editor of the Palestinian Chronicle. He is the author of 6 books, and his forthcoming book, Before the Flood, will be published by 7 Stories Press. His other books include Our Vision for Liberation, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, and The Last Earth. Baroud is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. I welcome Ramzy Baroud to Savage Minds. I am so happy to have you on the show, Ramzy. We've just kicked off the 5th season, so almost every single guest we've had, we've delved into the genocide in Gaza, and I've been interviewing, in fact, many scholars and journalists like yourself on Palestine and the ongoing genocide, focusing on both the political and media machinery that has not only allowed this genocide to occur, but that has vastly encouraged it. I'd like to kick off our conversation from as non-political a plateau as possible, which, as I say this, is completely absurd as a proposition because, as you well know, there is simply no non-political perspective on Palestine. Still, given what you have lived through as a Palestinian, I think it would behoove us to begin the conversation with your story, because you're not only a journalist, or you're not only a Palestinian journalist, but you are a Palestinian who has suffered directly the effects of Israel's genocide, and you are best placed to describe to our audience why truisms like Israel has a right to exist are not only absurdist, and they have no logic within the conversation of what's going on, but they are a complete derail to the truth of the history. Because the absurd nature of saying Israel has a right to exist is completely obfuscating the genocide at hand in much the same way that now we're told Trump's peace plan and bravo to Netanyahu is somehow this very sleek way of trying to erase the genocide that has been ongoing and that is still ongoing.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, my life is essentially is the life of the typical Palestinian refugee in a sense. Maybe being born and raised in Gaza made it particularly more difficult and kind of accentuated the degree of hardship versus maybe refugees being born in other parts of the Middle East or other parts of Palestine. But essentially, it is the same. We are all kind of victims. I use the term hesitantly because I do differentiate between being a victim of an event that's beyond your control and being victimized, or rather to embrace your victimhood. And I do not see my victimhood as part of my identity, to the exact opposite. In fact, we are a revolutionary, brave, courageous nation that never accepts its role in history as victims. But of course, we were victims of these circumstances that we did not control, that of British colonialism, the rise of the Zionist movement in Palestine, the decision that was made by someone else, somewhere else, that Palestine is a land with no people, and therefore it's a perfect fit for a people who supposedly have no land. And therefore there was that exchange, historical exchange, that was made to rewrite and rename and reinvent the land of Palestine to belong to someone else entirely, except of course that the land had a people, and not only a people but a historic nation that is so rooted that I would even dare claim that longer than time. I mean, we were there before time was registered as such. And we are aware of that. It's not like we are also, removed from our own historical trajectory. We are fully aware of who we are and where we come from. And then within the matter of few decades before the Balfour Declaration, 1917, that's when the British decided to grant historic Palestine to European Jews and the Zionist movement, to the displacement, the horror of displacement in 1948, when essentially the entire nation of Palestine, more or less, was gutted out within weeks, months, and just thrown into every part of the world. My family ended up being as refugees, we ended up being in the Gaza Strip. We lived in a refugee camp called Nusayrat. Of course, prior to our arrival, hundreds of thousands of people arriving with total destitution, penniless. Many of them are still sustaining wounds from previous massacres. And of course, there was that immediate famine. I mean, we talk about the famine during the genocide now as if it's a new phenomenon, but a lot of people also died from famine back after the Nakba in 1948. Before that time, Gaza was a different place. I mean, it was an area that this coastal area was called the Gaza District. The Gaza Strip is a new invention. It was called the Gaza District, and it was streamlined into the Palestinian landscape. You know, you have the Gaza District, and then you have the Jaffa District, today's Jaffa, and then you have the Haifa District. And it was just part of the Palestinian cultural, political, economic mosaic. And it was the home of about 80,000 people, mostly nomadic tribes, and the few aristocratic Christian and Muslim families that lived mostly in Gaza City and in Khan Yunis, in southern Gaza. We know about all of these places now. I mean, even an average person is now a master of geography of Gaza because all of these places are now affiliated with the Israeli genocide, the massacres, the famine, the so forth and so on. And my grandfather was so brokenhearted, he fell into deep depression. He did everything in his power to help his family survive. But he basically went into some kind of silence. He didn't speak much. I just remember growing up in a refugee camp, this very crowded place of want and despair, in which my grandfather was a man of very few words, and only later on I discovered that he was severely depressed. My grandfather on my mother's side died almost immediately after arriving to the refugee camp, leaving my grandmother having to take care of three boys and one girl completely on her own. That was a very, very difficult time, and it continues. As you know, Gaza is now even in a worse situation than it used to be back then. But one thing that also needs to be stated here that is almost immediately after the Nakba, immediately, the Fallahin, Arabic word for peasants, the peasants of Palestine who made it to Gaza, organized in many ways. They did not only organize in military formations, if that's the proper word to use, but they also organized in terms of a community. They set up tents and to created schools for children. I've actually documented one of these schools in a book of mine that is going to be published early next year, a school in Shati refugee camp in northern Gaza, of this woman who kind of took it upon herself to educate literally a whole generation of Palestinian children in the Shati. But they set up, 8 tents, school tents, and also they organized in terms of armed struggle. That was the rise of what they call the Fidaiyin movement. The Fidaiyin meaning the freedom fighters. They had no ideological affiliation, these Fidaiyin. They had no particular political schools of thoughts. They were just peasants who wanted to go home. At that time, the psychology of Gaza, the psychology of most refugees really, is that this is just a temporary phase in our history, and we're going to go back at one point. So they kind of organized with that idea in mind. In fact, the Fidaiyin, most of the work that they've done is that they would stage raids back to their villages from which they were expelled by Israel in 1948 during the Nakba, to retrieve some of the stuff they left behind. The gold of their wives, the clothes of their children, some of the harvest that was already collected but not sold or used, and that sort of thing, because they were really convinced that this is just a temporary stage and we're going to go back. Well, I mean, we know what happened then, and they never went back. And the Fidaiyin movement, most of the fighters were killed in counter-Israeli raids into the Gaza Strip that never stopped. Yet somehow the armed resistance did not stop, nor the cultural popular resistance in Gaza. I argue that Gaza is the heart of Palestinian history, not because of its massive landmass. It's only 181 square miles, about 360 square kilometers. Not because of its natural resources. Nobody knew that there was natural gas off the coast of Gaza until very recently. Not because of anything else. Gaza is the center of Palestinian history because of the resistance of the people, because the real asset of Palestine is the Palestinian people. With no people, there's no Palestinian struggle, there's no Palestinian cause. And Gaza has always been the embodiment of that. Even the element of class did not exist in Gaza at the same level. Yes, you had some people who are relatively better off than other people. You had few rich families or powerful families or clans, let's say. You had an aristocracy living in some neighborhoods in Gaza and some areas in Khan Yunis and Rafah, but ultimately the class distinction in Gaza was almost non-existent in many parts of the strip. And as a result, you have this collective, there's this wholesomeness about Gaza that made it in a way react in the same way, fight the same way, be victims of Israeli attacks and raids and wars and genocide in the same way. I also always argued that Gaza is the embodiment of socialism, real life socialism. Maybe not socialism in the familiar ideology, that we know, but socialism in how they felt that their existence, any community anywhere in Gaza, always understood that its existence is largely dependent on the existence of others. So they kind of all delved into this mutual aid, into this sort of kind of social contract that we need to help each other when we are in need. Just to give you an example, let's say that we had some kind of a celebration at my family. My brother graduated with, or my sister Suma, who was killed during the genocide, graduated from high school with high grades. In fact, she was one of the top 10 students in all of Gaza, and that's why she was selected to become a doctor. But when that happens, my father would, and my mother would cook a large amount of food, and they would have us as boys. We were 5 boys, and we would be running around the entire day just trying to deliver small meals to every neighbor, and then the neighborhood behind our neighborhood, and so forth and so on. And we would be giving food to 100 different families. The next day, another family would have something to celebrate, and they would reciprocate, and so forth and so on. At times, you could go for like days and days and days not cooking because other people are cooking for other people. And we have streamlined it in our culture in such a way that we're not even aware of the fact that we are, essentially helping each other survive. It was just people doing what comes natural to them. So Gaza was exceptional in that way. And this is why this genocide in Gaza and the ability of the people to survive is taking the world by it's shocking everybody. It's like, how is that possible? How are these people are able to survive when 92% of all of their homes are destroyed, all of their schools destroyed? Every single mosque of the 1,200 mosques in Gaza is destroyed. Of the 3 churches, all 3 are, the entire Gaza essentially is eradicated, yet they are able not only to survive, they still sing, they still celebrate, they still pray, they still share, they still do everything that the community had existed prior to the genocide. What makes that possible for Gaza? And the answer is that it's not about Hamas, it's not about Islamic Jihad, it's not about a faction, it's not about an individual, it's not about a group, it's about a rooted history that goes back decades that made Gaza what it is today.
Okay, you're on social media. You've seen all the naysayers, the horrible comments made about how there is no starvation in Gaza. Have you seen the Gazans? They need a treadmill, not food. That's a quote from one of the feminists who's been on me for many months about, again, the rape hoax that was part of the hasbara, what I call astroturfing, this genocide. Now, a lot of people, especially the feminists, and sadly the feminists, are very quick to believe anything. And yes, there's a certain political gullibility afoot. And I've been fighting this through publications of some of our writers, my own interviews on this subject. And it's really a hard battle to hold because people are willing to believe a lie despite proof of the contrary. I'm finding it really, it's more than a struggle at this point. You feel like you're in this, I call it the version of Dumb and Dumber, but Middle East version. People do not like facts. At least they don't like the facts that counter their own cynical beliefs, or more so racist beliefs. So how would you take your personal story to someone who says something like, the events of October 7th began everything. It's Hamas's fault, everything. If you crack a history book, of course you know this. Your own life knows this, Ramzy. But you have so many ignorant people on the internet, and I guess we could just say on the planet, in the West especially, who know nothing about this history. At the same time, most of the planet knows what you are saying and what books state is real, because the global South has lived various episodes of not the conflict in Gaza, but just having lived through colonization and the process of decolonization, which was brutal in most countries. They have seen what Western hegemony does when you push back. So, taking a bird's eye view of some of the crazy stuff that you have read over the past 2+ years, what can you say, for instance, to the project of feminists who talk about women's rights and Islam is bad for women and there were rapes on 7 October, how dare you say something else didn't happen? And they're pointing to no evidence. They're pointing to falsehoods such as, we know that men use rape during war, so it happened. What do you say to people who hold those beliefs that are based purely in prejudice?
I'm gonna be honest with you, and I wouldn't even I don't even know if I would want to even waste a minute of my time or anybody's time even responding to these individuals. But let me just kind of talk about two types of kind of identity politics. The first is one that is might appear genuine, might actually be genuine, but is basing its own information on just or its views, its opinions, and its outlook on disinformation or frankly quite a racist view of the other of the global South and everything that happens in the global South, from Afghanistan to Gaza to Iran, particularly Iran, and elsewhere. Now that group of people, one can maybe understand their view about issues prior to the genocide, but it's just hard to imagine that anyone with not only with a heart but also with a brain is able to look at this situation. I mean, if you had even Israelis talking about genocide, mainstream Israeli politicians talking about, if you have countries that are essentially and squarely on the side of the Israelis throughout history, and now they are speaking of genocide, and you have UN organizations that are very guarded in the language that they use, very hesitant in the language they use. They try to always create moral equivalence between the Palestinians and the Israelis, even though the Palestinians are occupied and oppressed, and the Israelis are the oppressors and the occupiers, coming out and saying it as it is. If Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, for example, speaks of genocide and apartheid and all of that, and we've seen the pictures and we've seen the reports, and if someone is still morally blind to all of this, there is no salvation to that person. Really, this is why I said I wouldn't even waste a minute on countering their points, because countering their points mean validating them to some extent, and that's what they want. They want to be validated, and they want to be the center of the conversation. And as a Palestinian who has fought for my entire academic and intellectual kind of career, if you will, to center and platform Palestinian voices, and not any Palestinian voices, the representatives Palestinian voices that really speak on behalf of the collective, and they are part of the overall collective experience of the Palestinian people. I wouldn't pay much heed to that and just keep centering Palestinians, because that's the only way you can actually overcome that kind of distraction that these groups create. And then you have the other, not necessarily feminists, but the other everybody, the other, superficial fake socialists and fake feminists and fake anybody and everybody who is, no matter what happens, they are part of a propaganda campaign. They come across as people who for something moral, stand up for something moral, but in actuality, they are part of an organized scheme working with and on behalf of Israel and Zionism. And I've noticed this as a speaker in recent years a lot because they have such a hard time kind of responding to the accusations of genocide and famine and all of that. So they try to kind of play on certain elements that might kind of trigger certain kind of emotional reactions, especially in Western societies. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was in Canada to speak about the situation in Gaza, and a lady stood up and she proposed what seemed to be an innocent question, completely unrelated to the conversation. And she says, thank you very much, Mr. Baroud. This is really insightful and very interesting. My question is about the treatment of women in Palestine. And is it true that Palestinian women are mistreated? And how does this relate to the mistreatment of women in Iran? And I was like, what is going on here? I mean, this is, um, you know, it's just not the subject of the conversation, and it seemed that
It's also quite racist, right? Because what you end up finding when these women pull this stunt is, are you so thick that you haven't a clue that Palestinians have little to nothing to do with Iranians? For instance, let's just begin there, right? Different language groups, different cultural heritage, vastly different histories. The cultural tapestries are too different, right? And somehow you saw this too when people say, well, why doesn't Lebanon and Egypt help out? Why don't they take the refugees? As if,
yeah, but this has been going on for such a long time. I mean, this idea that, oh, you keep complaining that Israel killed this number of Palestinians. Guess what? During the civil war in Jordan, Jordan killed this number. How come you're picking on Israel? You must be an anti-Semite. This is not logic. It's not rational thinking. This is why I'm saying they just, who was it? The American author who said, "Don't argue with an ignorant man because he is gonna pull you down to his level and beat you with experience." That's the whole idea. Mark Twain is gonna beat you with experience.
yes.
We can't allow them to pull us down to their level. But the thing when she asked that question, um, some of the Palestinian women in the audience stood up and agreed with her, even though clearly she had very, very ill intention. And then some of the men started countering about how Islam is kind to women, and then I just, as the audience turned against each other, I am looking at that woman. She sat down and she did not say a single word, but she had the most satisfied smile on her face. And this is what they do. They are just, for the lack of a better metaphor, the snakes in the grass. They just come out and they sting, and then they kind of crawl back and they kind of turn us against each other. So instead, I would rather to talk about my sister. Okay, if you want to talk about feminism, let's talk about my sister, because my sister was one of the first female doctors in Gaza. And I remember her talking about another female doctor in Gaza as her inspiration. And one day I'm going to become like that woman who was from an older generation. She went to Syria, she went to Aleppo, she studied there, she came back, and she became one of the best doctors. And then she specialized in family, family issues, and the kind of thing that would particularly help empower women, not just in the medical area on health issues, but also in society in general. So she ended up bringing this large group of women around her. Many of them became doctors, many became nurses and involved in the medical field. And then there was this movement, if you will, especially in Khan Yunis, where she lived, that became the center of a movement in which there was female empowerment, not as a political intellectual argument on Twitter or some other silly platform, but no, everyday life, women standing up for their rights and the rights of their families, but streamlined within the context of society, not as enemies, not as outsiders, not as marginal groups, or no, but as people who are effectively involved in keeping society strong. And she has done so many such contributions that when the Israelis assassinated her last year, there was this devastation that was felt by women in particular, because she served as this empowered woman who has indeed contributed directly and effectively to her society. But she also raised some of the most educated young men in Gaza. Her sons are, one is a lawyer, the other is an engineer. It's not a ideological conflict. It's a woman taking her actual right place in society and using that position to empower the rest of society. If you look at my grandma Zainab, you don't want to mess with my grandma Zainab. She was illiterate. She did not know how to read or write. She comes from the Nakba generation. She was a farmer back in Palestine before Israel existed, and she was, we had all these sorts of stories about when about I wrote about it in my previous books. Especially my father was a freedom fighter, how physically tough she was, but also very, she was very strong-minded person, very had all the leadership qualities that allowed her to navigate with her family throughout. Because I told you, my grandfather, very strong, beautiful, kind, spiritual man, became depressed. If it were not for Zainab, my family, my father's generation, would have not survived the famine and the hardship of Gaza in the post-Nakba years. That happened because of Zainab. Wasn't Zainab a feminist by today's definitions? Feminism is not just, having a social media account and just acquiring as many followers as possible, and also saying the most anti-feminist thing you can possibly imagine. You talk about, you come from, the global north, to teach our women, or to teach our society how to take care of their women, what at the same time you don't say a single word about the 17,000 or so women who were butchered, killed, raped in Gaza by the Israeli army. Where is the feminism in that? Where is the appreciation and the love for the role of women in society? These are not real feminists. Feminism, I mean, I grew up reading Edward Said, Chomsky, Howard Zinn, and that kind of generation of writers. And I thought that, I didn't even think that feminism is a gender-based struggle, because Edward Said used to say that I'm a feminist. So I grew up saying I'm a feminist, because the understanding here is that feminism, from a historical point of view, the Angela Davis generation, 60s, 70s, and so forth, was a generation in which feminism was an essential part of national liberation struggles. It was not an independent, separate phenomenon that is being used to, as you said, employing racist methodologies in order for them to break down society and end up serving the very interest of the people who are oppressing women. Colonialism oppresses women. Military occupation oppresses women. How many Palestinian women have given birth at military checkpoints in the West Bank? Forget about what happened to women in Gaza. We need, an endless number of hours talking about the struggle of Palestinian women, but just talk about what's happening to Palestinian women in the West Bank. That experience that's supposed to be sacred and special, when a woman giving birth at, surrounded by Israeli soldiers at military checkpoints, because the Israelis are not allowing the ambulances to cross to some hospital in Ramallah or in Hebron or somewhere else in the West Bank. When they ignore all of this and they just follow the same, kind of pattern, the same language, the same talking point, mixing between society, between religion, between nationalities, as you said, between language groups, and lump everybody together in order for them to exact one political concession, that since Palestinians oppress women, Israel is therefore the beacon of civilization. We go back to that old racist Orientalist language. We need to move past that entirely and just emphasize the power of the Palestinian woman, the power of the Palestinian societal experience, in which women have always been not only part and parcel, but rather in many, many ways the center of that collective experience.
I completely agree. In fact, I've been saying to people these last 2 years, this is proof that feminism as an ideological project has failed. Women's rights, obviously. You had people fighting for women's rights from way back that have been part of the long heritage of decolonization. If you look to Fanon, Césaire, Cabral, all the great intellectuals and heroes of post-colonializing Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, women's rights are there. But what about this notion that we have to obfuscate current affairs and pretend that men raped women? I mean, the whole thing beggars belief. And on top of this, we have the recent information that came out last week on Twitter by an IT expert who found that Israel's lovely 3D videos that we've seen over the years, where they're focusing in on the underground lair of Hamas, all fake. They've taken the architecture from art expositions, from artists' works, and this was proven. So people who think that the rapes of 7 October that were completely constructed to propagate and astroturf the racism that would convince Westerners to get behind the genocide, they're guilty. They're guilty. And we can look back to history. And when I was a kid and I learned about the Holocaust, I kept thinking, how could people allow this to happen? This is how it was allowed to happen, because people are subjective. We have agency. We can say no. And we see what part of the population is allowing the lies to go ahead and the ongoing genocide to perpetuate and to deepen. Let's go back to your sister, because I think you make great arguments for why women like your sister and many others, she was one of many medics and physicians killed, along with journalists. You and she represent the target of the Israeli state. They wanted to shut down the ability for Palestinians to recuperate physically from the horrific attacks of this genocide. And they wanted to shut down your voice as a journalist from being able to get the word out to the world what was going on. And we already know that the murders of Palestinian journalists exceeds any other conflict in human history that's been recorded. Can you talk a bit about that? Because we're losing journalists on an almost daily basis lately.
Yes, of course. Now, in some way, Israel has, it's like when you feel vindicated, but you're not really happy that you're vindicated because that comes at a price.
Right.
It's like sometimes you want to be proven wrong, but you are proven right, and you are sad that you are proven right because there was a very heavy cost to that notion. One thing I've always argued is that Palestinians, not only, I mean, the Che Guevara's famous statement, uh, people don't need liberators, they liberate themselves. I've always argued that ultimately the liberation will come from the Palestinians themselves. They have what it takes. It's not about how much weapons, it's not about how many, the firepower, it's about will. And the Palestinians as a people have the will to eventually triumph against Israel. But I've also argued that the Palestinian discourse in itself, in its entirety, independent from anything else, is capable of articulating the Palestinian narrative if it's given the chance to do so. And that Palestinians are not mute, and that they are not a liability to their own discourse is something that we have experienced, by the way, for such a long time, always trying to find someone to tell the story on our behalf because we're scared that we're not credible in the eyes of the West because of Zionist propaganda and hasbara. Therefore, bring the pro-Palestinian anti-Zionist Jew, bring the pro-Palestinian Westerner, bring everybody else, but don't bring the Palestinian because he doesn't know how. And if he does, well, there are so many obstacles to making the Palestinian likable in the eyes of Western audiences. And I've spent my career trying to prove this to be wrong. And this is why I ended up shifting, really. I mean, I was kind of going through the mainstream historical discourse about what happened in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration, the Nakba, the Naksa, First, Second Intifada. Everything is marked so nicely and seamlessly with, just a timeline. And, I always felt the need to recenter the Palestinian voice, because if you don't see the story from a Palestinian point of view, the story is always gonna be very, very limited and easily exploited, by the way, because everybody would try to exploit. The Arab is going to try to exploit Palestine as part of some sort of a pan-Arab, movement. The Muslim is going to tell you that this is, just part of a some sort of a Muslim revival. The socialist is going to do the same. The feminists, everybody is going to try to utilize Palestine to fit their own ideological, cultural, political, regional agenda. But at the end of the day, you miss the actual story, and that's the story of the Palestinian people as a collective. We know very little about it. And then the genocide, and this is why I started by saying, sometimes the kind of vindication that comes at a price. The genocide proved all of this wrong, right. On the one hand, you have Israel prevented international media from entering Gaza, forcing the Palestinians to utilize their own mechanisms, their own skills, their own talents. Even children in Gaza became influencers. Children, I follow this, I follow a group of young children who recite poetry and sing and have all of these incredible movement, kind of messages about defiance, about revolution, about resistance, about family. They read poetry from Mahmoud Darwish. They do all of these things, and they inspire us. I follow, I used to follow Saleh Ja'farawi before he was killed. We followed so many of these young people who basically taught themselves journalism, taught themselves how to communicate, and they do it in the most genuine way possible. They haven't been to Ivy League colleges. They haven't been to, top universities, media programs. They just learned how to do things during, under Israeli siege, during the times of famine, and at the end of the day, I mean, and this is where things really have changed. Without them, without these young Palestinians, without the Palestinian voice coming from Gaza itself, the world would have not known anything about Gaza and about Palestine. For 75 years prior to the genocide, the world had, Palestine has always been at the top of the media agenda. Everybody talks about Palestine in the news, about Gaza, about war, about this, about violence, about another, violent day in the Middle East and so forth. But the more they talk about it, the less they know. And I know that there was an actual poll, I think it was done by the Zughbi International Group during the Iraq War, mind you, that people, Americans, knew less about the Middle East during the coverage of the Iraq War compared to how much they knew about the Middle East before. So our mainstream media coverage is actually designed to confuse, to distract, to insert and infuse misinformation and disinformation on purpose. And now you have this unique, I would even argue, historically unprecedented experience where you have a group of people who are barely able to manage communicating a message to the outside world. When the internet is back, when there's a little bit of electricity, they would, charge their phones using car batteries, that sort of thing. And yet somehow they managed to convey the kind of information that switched to the global mentality on Gaza completely. Mustafa Barghouti, well-respected Palestinian intellectual and an activist and a medical doctor. He was in South Africa recently. And I saw him speaking on a podcast the other day, and he said something really interesting. He said he was speaking to some of the, kind of the leaders or the activists during the time of the apartheid era and during the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And they told him, according to Dr. Barghouti, that the solidarity with Palestine globally beats the solidarity with South Africa during the height of the anti-apartheid movement globally. And I believe it because I have been to many countries, starting with at the beginning of the genocide. And I've been to numerous cities, as close to the North Pole as you get and as far in the global South as you get. And I saw the shift I mean, it is just incredible. Ordinary people are aware of what is happening in Gaza. In Rome, I go to just to get some papers, signed for, just things related to my stay in Italy. And the atmosphere at that government office wasn't very pleasant. People were short and with each other, and then I gave her the paper, and she said place of birth, and I said Gaza, Palestine. And just the response, she just froze. She looked at me and she said, Palestine. I said, yes. She got emotional. I mean, and she looks at me and she said, oh my gosh, I have never imagined, she goes, that I will be able to write Palestine on an official document. What a beautiful moment, she said. And she wrote the word Palestine. I've never experienced anything like this in my life. And I can tell you numerous stories that kind of more or less express the same sentiment. Now, how did all of this happen? You would say, well, because of the brutality of the Israeli genocide. And because of everything that Israel has done to the children, to the women, to the men, to the infrastructure, to everything, and but is that enough? No, because you would have never known about it if it's not for the fact that someone has communicated it. You and I, Julian, we do not communicate these things. We amplify the facts, we amplify the voices, but who originated the intellectual production, the content production? The Gaza voices themselves. And that two things happen. Number one, this should change our entire mindset on the Palestinian discourse. Enough speaking on behalf of Palestinians, enough marginalizing Palestinians, it's enough speaking down at Palestinians, it's enough making Palestinians feel that they are a liability to their own cause. And no, we do not need someone to speak on our behalf, because we are more than capable of doing so. And by the way, most of the messagings that came out of Gaza came in Arabic. We translated them, we communicated them to the rest of the world, but even that original production comes in a language that the vast majority of the human race don't speak. So that's one thing. But also Israel made that discovery, and that's the tragic element. Israel made that discovery. And they discovered that as long as these Palestinian voices continue to speak, as long as hasbara is going to continue to struggle. And hasbara is not only struggling, but has been defeated like never before. Therefore, they went after the journalists. I mean, we talk about nearly 300 Palestinian journalists who have been killed. I think the number is much higher than that, because what qualifies someone to be a journalist? I mean, some of them might have not been members of the Palestinian Journalism Union, might not have official jobs with, I don't know, Reuters or AFP or Al Jazeera. Maybe they were freelancers. Many of them were bloggers. Many of them were social media influencers. Many of these individuals had much greater impact than those who were affiliated with official media, because they spoke much freely, and because they did not necessarily need to communicate their messages in a way that is consistent with the overall media agenda of certain organizations. So we are talking about a much larger number. At the Palestine Chronicle, we are a small organization with very little funding. And yet at the same time, we've actually lost several of our journalists. Some of them were assassinated outright. Wafa al-Udaini, talk about feminism, Julian. I mean, Wafa al-Udaini was a niqabi woman, was not just a hijabi woman. She did not just cover her hair, she covered her entire face. Yet she was one of the most powerful voices that ever came out of Gaza, of her defiance, of the beauty of her language and her sentiments, her emotions, centering the story within the overall collective story of the Palestinian people. They bombed her along with her husband and her children, and they killed them all in their house. We lost Wafa al-Udaini. We lost 3-4 other journalists who were officially or semi-officially affiliated with the Palestine Chronicle because of that. By the way, none of them are being counted as part of the 300 or so list of journalists that we are familiar with of the Palestinians. So we are talking about much larger number. Israel knew that these individuals, the likes of Wafa al-Udaini, are the greatest danger to their hasbara campaign. But then on the other hand, you have independent journalists like ourselves who are based outside of Gaza and who have centered their narrative, or rather have designated their mission as one that amplifies the voices of those in Gaza. And so they went after us. There are numerous legal cases against Palestinian intellectuals, journalists, organizations, my own organizations. We have legal cases, defending ourselves against the most outrageous accusations you can possibly imagine. And why are they doing this? To intimidate us.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. As a journalist, working from the United States, having to cut through the myths that legacy media and our government, and also the Canadian government and Western governments and those media sources, all that hasbara that they have parroted, and the media myths that have been created since the 1960s, from 67 to the two-state solution to Oslo, the representations and the misrepresentations of the first and second intifadas. What is your role as a journalist trying to honestly portray what's going on in the face of what is a kind of North American adopted hasbara approach? Because as you noted, over these last weeks, we saw the interception of the flotilla. Now, you and I both know that any group having intercepted the flotilla that was not the IDF would have been called terrorists, would have been accused of kidnapping, right? But Israel has received protection. It always has carte blanche to do what it wants, similar to the aggressions it's perpetuated throughout the summer. Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, on top of the genocide. We're seeing how the media language shifts. Anytime Israel does something, good. Anytime a Palestinian does something, suspicious. Tunnels under hospitals. Then there was, of course, the infamous media report this summer that one of Iran's missiles hit an Israeli site in an urban center, under which was allegedly IDF headquarters. Fascinating. I believe it was a hospital, in fact, or something similar. So we're seeing that a lot of the ideology perpetuated by Israel within even Western media, that this is in fact one of those every accusation is a confession type of situation, where we're seeing that Israel has done exactly what it has accused Hamas of doing for years. Could you speak to your role? Because, as you know, American media has been thick in misrepresenting everything, to such a degree, as an anthropologist, when I went to first work in the West Bank, living in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, back in 2003, the first thing that I experienced, the very first thing, aside from being kept in an airport for hours in the middle of the night, they wanted to interrogate me, and they did. As soon as I arrived in my hotel around 4 or 5 in the morning in Tel Aviv, I was really shocked by the treatment, but then the next 24 hours would bring me to an even deeper level of shock, to where I said to my partner, we've been lied to, meaning we Americans. This propaganda is so thick that when you get to Israel and you see the apartheid, and you see it, it's impossible to not see it as a foreigner, going in, getting the 5th degree at the airport and passing through one after another of Mahsam, these roadblocks. It's impossible not to see the apartheid that has been in place there. So when you are now in the United States and you are dealing with not only your work as a journalist, but you are having to sort of combat the myths that many readers have had. How do you do that?
Well, I have to state something that I think it's important here as a theoretical framework, if you will. I don't believe that the Israeli hasbara and propaganda is strong. Yeah, it is thick and it's domineering and it's everywhere, but it's not good. It's really terrible propaganda. It's not clever at all. The reason that Israeli propaganda and hasbara has prevailed over the years is not because of how clever and astute this propaganda is, but because the Palestinian was completely absent. the Palestinian narrative and discourse and the pro-Palestinian narrative and discourses were completely absent from the conversation, and because you couldn't poke holes in the Israeli propaganda even if you want to. No critical voice was ever allowed in mainstream media to persistently try to prove the Israeli propaganda to be just a large edifice of lies, simply because if you did so, then you are immediately an anti-Semite, immediately you are an Israel hater, you're immediately wanted to do terrible things to Israel and to the Jewish people, and then we end up talking about something entirely different. So people are scared, or were scared, up to a certain point. So this is where, I mean, just think about some of the propaganda, just the silly, pathetic propaganda of Israel during the genocide. When they went, for example, and they carried out that massacre in the Baptist hospital in Gaza, and then they tried to explain that propaganda, that massacre, saying, "Oh, an Islamic Jihad missile misfired and fell onto the hospital." Now, anyone who knows anything about the resistance capabilities, there is not a single missile that in the hands of the resistance that could possibly create the kind of damage that that missile has created, the Israeli missile that fell in the Baptist hospital. Also, any military expert can go simply, find few of the remains of that missile and analyze them within the matter of a day and tell you specifically where that missile came from, what kind of capabilities it has, who manufactured it, and all the rest. Because Palestinians were not allowed to do so, and because international experts were not allowed to go to Gaza and to investigate what happened at the Baptist hospital, where nearly 500 people were killed and many more wounded, the Israeli propaganda persisted. CNN, Fox, CNBC, BBC, everybody was conveying the Israelis are saying that it's the Palestinians who had a missile misfire and fall onto the hospital. And then you kind of have that viewpoint suddenly is the viewpoint. It is the theory that needs to be proven incorrect. And then suddenly the Palestinians who are the victims of that massacres are the one, the onus is on them to prove that it's not true. And of course, Al Jazeera came and tried to investigate and other independent, but of course, very little of that made it to mainstream media. So the result is the story would have been that Palestinians have massacred their own people because they had a missile that misfired. If it were not for the fact that later on, I mean, notice how that theory has completely disappeared now. Nobody is talking about what happened at the Baptist hospital soon after the start of the genocide, because Israel since then pretty much attacked, bombed, and obliterated every major hospital in Gaza, carried out major massacres that are well documented throughout the war. In the Shifa hospital, the largest medical complex in Gaza City, they executed hundreds of people, including women and children. Children, their bodies were found tied behind their backs with their moms, executed and buried in mass graves, and the mass graves have been dug out. And as a result, mainstream media stopped talking about what happened at the Baptist hospital. So it's not like the Israeli propaganda was so bulletproof, was so clever. My gosh, these guys know how to create these superficial or falsified narratives. No, it was just because Palestinians were not allowed to tell their story, period. They have been erased from mainstream media, and nobody could criticize Israel. And so if you look at the list of all the Israeli lies, for example, when they went to the Shifa hospital, because they've been claiming that what happened at the Shifa hospital was that Hamas had its headquarters under the Shifa hospital. And they made this claim over and over and over again. And American mainstream newspapers would have these infographics showing the complexity of Hamas's city that was built under the hospital. Nobody was talking to Hamas. Nobody was talking to anyone. Nobody talked to me about it. It's just the Israeli viewpoint. It's not even a viewpoint. It's a lie. It's a stupid lie that went unchallenged. And as a result, the Israelis got away with that lie until later on they went to the hospital to find the city, but there was no city. The tunnels that they found were not Hamas tunnels, they were the Israeli tunnels and structure that was built under the hospital when they were in occupying Gaza between after 1967. So that lie also died out with time. So that's what it is. It's not the power of hasbara, it's the fact that mainstream media and corporate media exist to amplify the Israeli lies and to use the Israeli lie as the theories that need to be proven wrong. And then who is going to be there to prove them wrong? People who have some good sense, people, experts, neutral, investigators and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, they are almost never given the space or the chance to speak. So we have to differentiate between the power of the Israeli hasbara and just the fact that this hasbara, as foolish as it is never challenged because we just don't exist on the map of mainstream media. The other thing I would like to say about mainstream media and corporate media is that, this idea that we can change the media. No, we can't change the media. We can't change mainstream media because by definition, corporate media exists to serve the interests of the corporation. They don't wake up in the morning, these journalists and these, media bosses. It's like, let's tell some truth today. Let's try to, educate the masses. They don't care. They have interest, and the interests are tied with big companies, and these companies are tied to military manufacturing companies, oil companies, media groups, think tanks, governments, lobby groups. And they are there to ensure that they are doing the job that they have been assigned to do. And if that means lying all the time, they are going to lie all the time. So that's another illusion of trying to fix corporate media, because you can't have the media behave contrary to the interest of the corporation that funds that media. I have a theory usually that, and I've repeated this theory a lot, and that is anyone who's going to give you $1 million as a media organization, and of course it's our arbitrary number in a sense, but there's a point behind it. Not 900,000, 999,000, no, $1 million and above, just like that, unless he has an agenda. Might be a good agenda, I don't know, but there is an agenda, right? Only independent media, only independent voices are the ones that are able to actually reveal the truth about what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, anywhere in the world. This is what we call community journalism. If some call it militant journalism, you know what? If you're going to go that far, that's fine. We are militant journalists because that's what we do. But so some clear distinction has to be made here. What worries me so much is that in coming months, Israel is going to counterattack because Israel has lost the world. Even Trump himself has admitted that. The world hates Israel. And there's going to be a counterattack. And we need to be ready and prepared to fight back to ensure that Israel does not regain the initiative and does not find itself in a position where it's once more dictating our understanding of what's happening in Palestine and beyond Palestine, by the way.
Yes, plus the larger problem of the rise of anti-Semitism that is being claimed, for instance, after the attack 2 weeks ago in Manchester, outside of the synagogue, we are now seeing how all British Jews are fearful of their lives. Well, there are two things to say to that. One, many British Jews are with you and me on this. They see this as an atrocity. They want nothing to do with what Israel is doing. And many Jews around the planet have real problems with this assumption that Zionism is a moral obligation for Jews. There is, in fact, no room for us to discuss the racism inherent within Zionism because it is a fundamentally and uniquely racist discourse. There's that. The other day I had David Miller on the show who spoke about his being sacked for basic truism, the links between Zionism and Islamophobia, which are long documented and well known. But, who cares about facts these days? Still, we have a serious dilemma amongst our world society, if we can call it that, where, as you rightly point out, mainstream media doesn't care. No one wakes up and says, let's appoint Bari Weiss because she's the voice of truth. We know that that's not true from what she's already done with her publication that was bought out. We're seeing the hasbara buyout of American media. That's appalling. But all of this feeds back into the self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. People say, oh, but you can't say that the Jews run Hollywood and Jews own media. Well, in those words, sounds a little suspicious, but to say that there has been a Zionist takeover of U.S. media is not inaccurate. And now we can speak about perhaps there will be a rise of anti-Semitism, given that the world has had on their mobile and computer screens for over 2 years live streaming of a genocide. That would make many people angry. And here's the thing, Ramzy. For so many years, and I don't mean recent years, for decades, the Zionist lobby has attempted to conflate Judaism with Zionism, which is false. There is no conflation to be made, but they have tried and essayed to do so. Now the success of that lobby might actually have some sort of fruition in the rise of anti-Semitism, because when you struggle so much to get people to understand that Israel are Jews, Jews are Israeli, etc., this will eventually trickle down to people who are working 3 and 4 jobs and don't have time to understand the fine-tuned distinctions between a racist ideology such as Zionism and the fact that Jews are autonomous human beings who are not at all Israeli and who in fact disagree with the ideological racism inherent within that doxa, as it were. So what we're seeing, and what we will probably see, is a rise in anti-Semitism because Israel and hasbara has long attempted to get people to see Jewishness and Zionism as the same. And this genocide is distinctly being waged in the name of Zionism, not Jewishness. So people are going to push back on both because Israel has well trained the world's population to understand them as a unique monolith, which again, they are not. You see?
Absolutely. I do fully agree that Zionism is the true enemy of the Jews, if we are to use kind of reductionist and kind of terminology. Because when you carry out a genocide and you assign that genocide in the name of protecting Jews and to show, Jewish power, for example, like in fact, there's a political, is it Ben Gvir who has the Jewish Power Party? There's a party in the Israeli Knesset called Jewish Power. As if that is not even self-indicting as it is. When you have that sort of language, that sort of discourse, then people, the people that you say that don't have the time to, read the nuances and the fine-tuned language and the intricacies of this language, well, they are going to make the assumption that indeed Israel represents Jews. And that is a major problem. So Israel has done the Jews a major disfavor because you carried out one of the worst genocides in history. And you said, oh, by the way, this is done by the Jews, for the Jews, and on behalf of the Jews. What do you think is going to happen as a result? So yes. And this is why we have to be careful about this, because because this is going to benefit Israel. If that association is made that way, it's going to benefit Israel, because Israel only, Zionists only seek this kind of, immediate, kind of gains. They want a situation in which if you criticize Israel, they will assume that this is a form of anti-Semitism and they will act upon it in universities, in your workplace, in any mainstream society, and just, kind of go after people supposedly for being racist and anti-Semitic. I attended the first anti-Zionist Jewish conference in Vienna a few months ago. And it's the first in the sense that it was one of the largest and most organized, and included numerous small Jewish groups from all over Europe and the US. And I was very happy to be there, in a sense that I felt like maybe it is time that we start reversing, this whole, de-link the relationship between Israel and Jews, where many Jews say, no, you do not speak on my behalf. It's not committed in my name. But not just that, not even center themselves as anti-Zionist Jews, but actually see their struggle as part and parcel of the larger global solidarity movement. And in fact, there were lots of really promising movements and new discourses that are developing in that regard. Israel, of course, is going to try to prevent that from happening because they are very, very keen on making that link. And of course, we are gonna. I'm worried that we are gonna start seeing a lot of anti-Semitic attack, being false flags or others, that would slowly try to reassert the centrality of the anti-Semitic discourse as part of the Zionist discourse, the anti-Palestinian discourse, the anti-Muslim discourse, the anti-discourse of anybody who's critical of Israel. This is, the Zionists are not going to take this lightly. They are already developing all sorts of mechanisms. They are trying to buy TikTok. Netanyahu recently in the US had a meeting with major influencers, paying them $7,000, I believe, a month in order for them to just repeat Israeli lies and convey, the Israeli propaganda. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I think Israel has reached a point where I don't think people are as terrified as they used to be. They're not as scared. They are also aware of the how Israel weaponizes anti-Semitism in its favor. So there is going to be an arduous struggle, in my opinion, in the coming months and years. We cannot allow Israel to regain the initiative and to win back this kind of its status as the representative of all Jews. For that to happen, Jews would have to rise. I mean, anti-Zionist Jews will have to rise, but again, not as a separate movement that is neither with Israel nor with the Palestinians, but as part and parcel of the pro-Palestine solidarity movement worldwide. And I think they have a fundamental role to play in this regard. I don't believe that Israel can possibly. I mean, it would take a miracle for them to be able to regain the initiative on this. When the degree of the pro-Palestinian sentiment now can be felt, and again, I've been everywhere from Rome to Paris to small towns in southern Spain to Palestinian flags, stop the genocide, free Palestine, Palestina Libre. It's just penetrating the very, the bottom layers of every society everywhere. This is a changing dynamics that I don't think buying TikTok is gonna magically shift anytime soon. And this is why we need to build on this moment. We need to continue working on this. We need to continue to expose Israel, to empower Palestinians, to center their voices, to delve deeper into the Palestinian narratives beyond cliches. I mean, this is why I was particularly happy you started your conversation with me today with, tell me about yourself, your positionality, your relationship with Palestine from the very beginning until today. This is the kind of story we need to be looking at, because without understanding Palestinian culture and history from the Palestinian point of view, I think our understanding will always be lacking and vulnerable to the fabricated discourses of Zionism.
I would have thought the AIPAC lobby had bankrolled more pro-Zionist opinion in the US than in the UK. But recent polls are showing that that's not true. There are actually quite a few, even Guardian independent readers of the publications, The Guardian and The Independent in the UK, liberals who are sympathetic to Israel, notwithstanding the genocide. I find this horrifying because you can be A, not an anti-Semite, and B, at the same time, against a genocide. Somehow there's been a success in the UK for creating a generation of quasi-leftist liberals, for sure, who fully support Israel and are very reticent to accept the word genocide in association to what we've seen the last 2 years, not to mention, Ramzy, that the genocide in Gaza predates October 2023. Can you speak about this kind of, I call it historical guilt. I do think there's an inherited historical guilt as well, because we're talking about Brits in their 30s, 40s, 50s who weren't around when the Balfour Declaration was drawn up. There's some kind of odd allegiance that has been happening amongst liberals in the UK who are showing deference to the state of Israel. Why is this happening, do you think? And it's happening in greater numbers today than it is in the States, where you have even right-wing folks, or pseudo-right-wing, because I don't really think Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson are that far to the right, but they are coming out in full force, and they are very much against this, and they have other Republicans behind them.
Right. And I think, I mean, the Western Marxism, Western leftism has always been problematic. There's a very good book. I think it was written by, if I remember the name or pronouncing it correctly, is Domenico Lizardo, A Critique of Western Marxism. I think the name of the book is Western Marxism. And it talks about, how many in the Western left, has kind of carried out the same Eurocentric and ultimately pro-imperialist ideological currents. To the point that they became racist like everybody else, colonialist like everybody else, condescending like everybody else, and looked down at the global south. I mean, all the socialist experiments and revolutions and rebellions in the global south have never really registered as a model of socialism and leftist movements that worth celebrating, understanding, dissecting. I mean, how many leftists in the West, for example, and actually understand that once upon a time, and not too long ago, the Yemen was divided to two countries. One was a socialist Yemen, and so this kind of thinking, this Eurocentric left, struggles so much with what's happening in Palestine. Because on the one hand, they feel like they need to pay lip service to, how this is all part of the anti-imperialist this and that. But at the same time, they're not willing to concede all the way. They're not willing to see Zionism, fully the way it should be dissected and understood as an imperialist, colonialist, nasty, racist, chauvinist, ideological system. So they always try to kind of find this kind of middle ground. This is why, you started talking about feminism, and it's kind of part of the same problem, because they can't concede all the way. Conceding all the way means, kind of acknowledging the significance of the global South within the socialist revolutionary movements or the socialist ideological paradigms in general. And so there is this kind of degree of ownership. I cannot let go. I cannot acknowledge, for example, that essentially what's happening in Gaza is an outcome of a socialist social movement that allowed the people of it. No. They have to recognize, how about women? How about the religiosity of Gaza? That has to undercut any kind of achievement that's coming out of the Strip. The same thing with Iran. It gives you some kind of ownership. And The Guardian, I think, has always been an example of that. Never been a fan of The Guardian myself. Honestly, there's always this dilly-dallying, this tiptoeing around the idea. On one hand, you feel like, okay, well, that's kind of different than the New York Times and certainly different than the Fox News, but it's not quite there. There's always this but, there's always this context, there's always this kind of subtle indictment of the Palestinians and their struggle. And it's an expression of most of liberal media really in the West. And so while many people are just fawning over, how different the likes of The Guardian is, I am always very suspicious, because I always know that there is an agenda just lurking in, and, where they are just not willing to concede, because concession also here means moral accountability. Moral accountability to everything that the West has done. But if you are Western centric and Eurocentric and you see the world where you are the one who assigns the issue of morality or lack thereof, if you look at Bolivia, for example, you look at Cuba and Venezuela, and now Colombia, and you look at at the rest of the world with this kind of, you are the one who assigns who is violating human rights and not. You are the one who assigns whether Cuba is an actual socialist country or an autocratic dictatorship. You give yourself that moral power. Western intellectuals do not want to concede their moral ascendancy. They don't want to concede their moral position. So they might be critical of their governments. They might be critical of Israel even. They might call it apartheid, and yes, they might use the word genocide. But at the end of the day, they still have to reserve something that belongs to them and to them only. And that's what makes the Western leftist intellectuals, not all of them, definitely not all of them, but quite problematic in general. And this is an issue that surpasses that of Palestine and Israel, and includes many other subjects as well, from China to the Soviet Union to many others. I do strongly recommend this book by Lizardo, especially that he talks quite, dedicate much space to talk about the hypocrisy of the leftist intellectual when it comes to Palestine and Israel.
For our listeners who want to read this book by Domenico Lizardo, it's available for free. You can download it at Internet Archive. Most of our listeners are very sympathetic to what is happening to Palestinians and what has been going on since the Nakba. Many, however, before 7 October were not aware of the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians with the creation of the State of Israel. Now, there are other mitigating factors since 1948. I made a film called Makhsam, where I show on my trip when I was living in Jerusalem and would have to go through Ramallah and then take those taxis all over the West Bank. Sounds fancy taxi for people listening, but it's not Fifth Avenue, New York taxi. These are just collective cars where you get in with other people and you go as far as you can on the segregated roads that are only allowed for Palestinians, and the settlers pass on other roads, and you travel anywhere from 5 to 20, sometimes more minutes before you arrive at a roadblock from which you exit the car. IDF soldiers abound, 19, 20-year-olds mostly, and you witnessed, as a Westerner, I witnessed many young Palestinian men being harassed, being stopped, being frisked, being not allowed to go through. And this is how you travel through the rubble, going through a house that's been bulldozed. That can take a few minutes to get around. Then you'll find more Israeli soldiers with their weapons. You will go into another taxi, continue your journey until the next roadblock. And I've had to explain to people who do not understand what occupation looks like. This is why even people in the West Bank, which was Hollywood glamorous compared to Gaza before October 2023, that many and most Palestinians cannot get to their places of work, which was even worsened with the building of the separation barrier. So you have a whole population in the West Bank that is living in a cheddar cheese cutout of its once former mapped self, because when you look at the official map that the Western nations carrying hasbara that put on their websites, like the BBC, they'll show a very neat Gaza, a very neat West Bank, but they're not showing the B'Tselem map. And B'Tselem is the Israeli NGO which shows all the settlements, and it is Swiss cheese. So you're having to do this jumping around, going around settlements, these roads that are segregated to only Palestinians with roadblocks all over them. A 20-minute journey becomes hours, 4, 5 hours. Of course you can't work when you live like that. So can you talk, Ramzy, to what, let's leave Gaza alone since Gaza is destroyed. Let's talk about the more quote-unquote livable West Bank. Can you describe to our listeners what that is like to the average Palestinian living there?
Well, we know that occupied Palestine has been occupied since 1967. The word occupation is not a swear word. It's not a negative word per se. It's a legal term. It is the international law's way of trying to designate a special kind of a clear kind of relationship between the occupier and the occupied. When Palestine or the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, They are meant to de-alienate that Israel has certain responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Agreement and other relevant international law agreements and resolutions, and humanitarian laws as well. So, as an occupying power with a capital O, capital P, Israel needs to behave in a certain way until that occupation ends. Military occupation is never meant in international law to be a permanent status. It is meant to be a temporary situation until the whatever conflict, whatever situation is resolved. And certainly, the occupying power has no right to ethnically cleanse the population, the occupied population, to control every aspect of their lives, to violate their lives in every possible way, including their very very right to live, and definitely does not have the right to imprison them in whole or in mass, neither behind checkpoints and walls, as in many parts of the West Bank, or to their prisoners to the territories of the occupying power. And absolutely, most definitely, international law does not allow for the occupier to bring its own civilian population and have them live in illegal settlements behind barbed wires and walls in order for them to steal and confiscate and burn the land and the orchards and the homes of the occupied. So not only Israel is an occupying power by legal definition, Israel has violated every possible aspect of its responsibility as an occupying power, turning the occupation of the Palestinians into a permanent status. And you are absolutely right. I mean, I don't think there is at any point anywhere in the West Bank, certainly not in the northern West Bank, certainly not in the Jerusalem area, certainly not in the Jordan Valley, where you would stand on top of a hill and you would kind of look in front of you, behind you, to your right or to your left, and you're not going to see some aspect of Israeli occupation. Military camps, settlements, Jewish-only roads, and that sort of thing, or at least some form of destruction carried out by Israel, a burned orchard, a confiscated land, and so forth and so on. Some of these areas, especially in the north and West Bank region, you kind of see the wall. I mean, we know how the wall snake kind of snakes up the, over Palestinian land in the West Bank, the apartheid wall. But some of these villages are actually, the wall kind of turns around in a certain way and circle them entirely so that they cannot leave, especially those living in area, what they call Area C. And I'll talk about this in a second. So they are completely encircled. They are an actual prison. And to leave that prison, they need a card, they need a permit. And the permit sometimes comes, sometimes doesn't. But even if they do have the permit, these villagers, to reach their jobs, their schools, their farms, they have to stand in long lines every single day for the soldier to allow them in or out from the gate that is, around the checkpoint or around the apartheid wall. The soldier sometimes is not there. He had a long lunch. He decided to take the day off. He's drunk. Whatever the circumstances is, you could actually have children getting trapped, coming back from school in an open area until late at night, waiting for the gate to be open while their family is waiting for them on the other side. I mean, the life of the Palestinian in the West Bank is just, I feel like it's been downgraded, the suffering of the Palestinian in the West Bank, downgraded a bit because of the genocide in Gaza, because sometimes our understanding of hardship is relative to other hardship. So because there's an outright genocide in Gaza and total destruction of Gaza, suddenly it appears that the West Bank, as you said, a bit more livable. But the number of Palestinians killed in the last 2 years in the West Bank by far exceeds any number of Palestinians killed in that area for the last several decades. Much destruction, entire communities. The Ain Shams refugee camp, for example, has been entirely destroyed and all of its population pushed out. Much, if not all, of the Jenin refugee camp has been destroyed, its population pushed out. The latest numbers I read is about 40,000 families have been ethnically cleansed from the northern West Bank. I think the number has to be a lot higher now. because that was a number from a good number of months ago. So life is in the West Bank is extremely difficult. And what made it difficult is the fact that even under the division of the West Bank into area A, B, and C, according to the Oslo so-called peace process decades ago, Area C is the largest of these areas, about 60% or, more or less of the West Bank. And that is under total Israeli military control. But even Area A and B, Area A under about 20%, under total Israel, under supposed Palestinian autonomy, and the other area, Area B, under some sort of mutual control by the Palestinian security and Israel. Even these areas have been completely violated. There is no such thing as Palestinian control over anything. The West Bank is back to its old days of total Israeli military control and occupation. And Israel is not lying about it. I mean, this is why I'm saying Israeli propaganda is not clever. And I'm going to keep pushing that over and over again. It's not clever. When Netanyahu, for example, comes and says, oh, you know what? Our ultimate objective, my mission in life is to create greater Israel. That's not conspiracy theory. It's not propaganda. He said it. And the Arabs did not say anything in response, by the way. When he comes and says, we want to annex the West Bank, and then they pass laws in the Knesset to annex the West Bank and to push the Palestinians of the West Bank out of the West Bank. It's not clever. There is no propaganda. It just, we don't hear about it in mainstream media because it is covered up all the time. Mainstream media serves the goal of serving as the shelter of the Israeli violent language and behavior. So this is not propaganda per se, it's someone just basically hiding the truth. And the Israelis, in their defense, are very open about their objectives in the West Bank and Gaza, what they want to do. So the West Bank is going to be, depending on what's going to happen in Gaza next. I mean, I don't know if we are going to be going back to the genocide in its current form of the last 2 years, or we are going to find ourselves kind of entering into a different type of killing and control. But the West Bank is going to be the new platform, if you will, of Israeli oppression. Now Israel is going to have more soldiers, more investments in the West Bank, and whatever sense of defeat that they were left with, that they just simply could not crush the Palestinian resistance and could not push the Palestinians out of Gaza, they need to compensate for that somehow. And that is by going to the West Bank in full force and try to achieve all sorts of things that would allow the right wing and the fascists in Israeli society to feel empowered, to feel that their overall ultimate goal in Palestine is still there. So I think we are going to see a lot of violence, sadly, in the West Bank. This is a no-brainer for me. And the fact that the life in the West Bank, which is so difficult to begin with, is going to get even more difficult. I mean, we've seen the prisoners, the Palestinian, or rather captives, held in Israeli prisons who were freed as a result of the exchange between the resistance and Israel. And imagine, I don't know if there's any form of military occupation in the past that reached this degree, that they would ensure that Palestinians do not celebrate the release of their children, their women and their men who have been in prison, some of them for decades. That they are not allowed to receive them. They are not allowed to celebrate. They're not allowed to sing and dance. They are not allowed to show, to decorate their houses. They would raid the houses and take down any decorations to prevent them from even celebrating the fact that their children have been freed after spending decades in Israeli prison. Who controls the narrative to that degree? The degree of control over the occupied Palestinian in the West Bank is really something unprecedented, even in Gaza. Gaza is destroyed, but the spirit of Gaza remains free. When the prisoners of Palestine reached Gaza, they celebrated in mass. They celebrated in mass and they carried them on their shoulders. But when they were freed in Ramallah, they were not allowed to do so. The Palestinian security forces were there to ensure that they don't speak to the media. They were all kind of corralled into a specific place, and everybody was taken to his family home without without anyone being allowed to celebrate their release. That's the degree of control. And sadly, in the West Bank, it's even worse in a sense, because you have the lines of control, not only Israel, the Israeli army, but also Israeli settlers that work and coordinate very closely with the Israeli army. And they are very armed and very, very violent. And then you have the Palestinian Authority, which also coordinates with the Israeli army. So you have kind of three lines of defenses there for Israel: the army, the settlers, and the PA. And they are all working to control the very words that are spoken, the very songs that are being sung, the very act of celebrating conducted by a Palestinian family. The situation in the West Bank is very, very difficult and is going to get more difficult. And I don't know when there will be any kind of rebellion in the West Bank, considering this kind of these kind of control mechanisms there. But there has to be a point where Palestinians in the West Bank must carry out some kind of an uprising, because this is just not sustainable, considering that Israel's ultimate goal is to annex the West Bank and push the Palestinians to Jordan. So I don't think that this is a sustainable situation for coming years. And I think right now, in fact, as we speak, Israel is carrying out mass arrest campaigns, raiding various villages and towns in the West Bank, because I think they are also aware that the fact that the Gaza genocide is slowing down a little bit might be an opening for people in the West Bank to carry out some sort of an uprising. So they are trying to send them a message that this is how you are going to be treated. Shall you dare rebel against the Israeli occupation?